Hello my friends, and welcome back to part 2 of my Stitch With Me and also history podcast. That seems to be what it's kind of turned into. Who would have said that these things don't go together? Well, I beg to disagree. Because I'm bringing my love of history to you, and I think it's becoming very enjoyable. So yeah, I think I shall do some more of them. I also have to say that I'm really delighted with the feedback I got from the first video. So if you just landed here and you want to go back and see that part 1 video, there is a link in the description for you to follow. And just before I continue with the history session, I'm working on Home for the Holidays by Thomas Kincade. This is a heaven and earth design which I started very late at the end of last year, and I'm roughly at about 42% now. I'm working 2/1 10 stitch. I really love this chart. It's got such beautiful colors, such a beautiful scene, and I'm working the mini version, so it's not going to take me forever to finish, hopefully. I say that with tongue in cheek because sometimes, you know, life gets in the way, but I seem to have been working quite consistently well on this one, and I'm really enjoying how I'm doing it as well. At the moment I'm working these sort of columns, which is something I haven't done for a while. I don't know what made me decide to suddenly work columns. I was doing diagonals. Maybe I've been doing too many diagonals and decided I just wanted to go and do something a bit different again. So I'm back onto the columns. And it's quite an easy stitch at the moment where I'm working because it is up in the sky area. And the bottom sort of section of this chart is quite a lot of confetti. So I'm quite happy to be working on the sky area and getting quite a lot of that filled in. And then once I get tired of this sort of background, I then move on to doing a little bit on the more confetti area, which is at the bottom of the chart. So I shall continue to stitch whilst giving you this second part of the Mary Queen of Scots story. So in part 1, I talked about my favourite queen from the Tudor period, Mary Queen of Scots. And I spoke about her return to Scotland after her early life in France, and about how there was a lot of animosity towards her from some of the powerful lords in her court. I can quite understand why they would be disgruntled and even probably secretly afraid of this powerful woman coming back from France and invading their court. The earlier part of her reign in Scotland was definitely shaky from the start. Religion and politics intertwined, never a good mix. And men also had sort of reservations about women's ability to rule. They were not convinced that they could rule as well as male sovereigns might. It was clear for me to see after reading her biography that Mary was not born into an easy role at all. And of course, being a devout Catholic, she wasn't prepared to convert to Protestantism. Her mother was a French Catholic, and her extended family, her maternal uncles called the Guises, well, they were powerful in the French court. So Catholicism was more than just a faith for her. I think it was her identity, and this was not something that she could, you know, just slip off like a mask just to suit everybody's agenda. Also, to understand the actions and desires of people during this period in history, I think it's necessary to understand the play of power, which of course combines 3 very important elements, those being politics, religion and succession. The important matter of, you know, who would rightly inherit the crown and who could also grab it, you know, through more cunning, opportunistic ways. There are always very many people who felt that the crown should be theirs, even if, you know, that really wasn't the case. So even though Mary stood her ground with her faith, she had no problem no problem at all allowing Protestants to continue practicing their faith. From the Protestant ministers that were here at the time, namely the unlikable John Knox, who I mentioned in my first video. And of course he used to give sermons in the kirk. The kirk is an old word, just an old word for church, by the way. So he would give sermons to her subjects. And of course the people were able to live freely with their own beliefs. But what Mary really wanted was, what I believe she wanted, was for her court and her subjects to respect her as their sovereign queen. Despite the religious differences, she was willing to, accept them. So she felt, why should they not accept her? But we have to remember that this was not a religiously tolerant period of history. King Henry VIII had some years before her imposed his own religious laws, and he had professed to be the head of the Church of England and, rid the British Isles of popery. It was only when his eldest daughter, Mary Tudor, came to the throne that yet another religious rebellion persisted, and it was one for which she was nicknamed Bloody Mary. And under her rule, the cruel burning of Protestants took place in her desperate attempt to reverse the damage that her own father had done. I think it was an attempt for her to return England once again to its Catholic roots, of course. But this was short-lived. Mary Tudor was only to reign for 5 years, and then she too died. And by the time Mary Queen of Scots returned to Scotland, England was once again a Protestant nation. Elizabeth, who was Mary Queen of Scots' cousin, had so far been very tolerant of Mary's return to Scotland and of her Catholic faith. But of course it would be a tricky situation for Elizabeth. Mary had Catholic supporters in England itself. They were of course unhappy, disgruntled. They wanted to see Mary on the throne of England instead of her cousin, the Protestant Elizabeth. And some even felt that Elizabeth had no right to be on the throne of England, calling her illegitimate because of her father's blasphemous marriage to Anne Boleyn. A marriage, by the way, which had not been sanctified as a holy marriage, not blessed by Rome. But even so, letters passed between the two queens when Mary returned to Scotland, and Elizabeth supported and welcomed Mary back to her country. And Mary replied, sending back her sisterly devotion. So despite the ever-present threat of Mary, Elizabeth fully believed that an anointed queen had a divine right to rule. And Mary was the Queen of Scotland by blood, not just by marriage. So Elizabeth saw it as an unlawful and unholy thing to harm her, to go against her in any way. And we were to find out later on that, well, really, she was left with little choice. Because her biggest problem was that Mary also had a right to her throne. So just how much could Elizabeth really trust her? In the first part of this Mary Queen of Scots videos, I showed you a little inside her bedchamber and the palace that she resided in when she returned. We also got as far as the death of her first husband in France. So let's look a little bit at her second husband. So this is a photograph of Lord Darnley, Mary Queen of Scots' second husband. I love this chap, even though there was at the time nothing lovable about him. Darnley was the son of Matthew Stewart. He was the 4th Earl of Lennox, and his mother was Lady Margaret Douglas. He had a strong claim to the English succession in his own right. He was a direct descendant of King Henry the 7th, I believe, and he descended from Scottish royalty. He was also related to Mary, and he was a Catholic as well, so he had a lot of credentials. He was strong, athletic, he could dance, play the lute, and he was well versed in courtly life. And apparently he tried very hard to seduce Mary, which was an act encouraged by both of his parents. It was said that when Mary first saw him, she said, quote, "He is the lustiest and best proportioned long man I have ever seen." So Mary was tall. She was about 6 feet, around 6 feet tall, which was really an unusual height for a woman in those days. And Darnley happened to be also a few inches taller than her. So obviously there's going to be an attraction there, no doubt. And he was on his best behaviour, of course. He wooed her, he wanted her to find him impressive, he wanted her literally to fall in love with him. And when he arrived in Edinburgh in 1565, he and Mary were constantly together. She gave him a knighthood and an earldom. She threw titles over this Darnley guy like popcorn. And as the months wore on, her lords were just were not liking it. Okay, so of course, Darnley was on his best behaviour with Mary, and people could see through it. And also they could see how she fell for it. But soon enough, the banns of marriage were called, and when Elizabeth found out that they were to wed, well, she was furious. Absolutely furious. I mean, she had been helping Mary to choose a suitor for a while, but Mary really wanted to choose her own husband. And the problem was that Darnley was yet another threat to Elizabeth's throne. So the two joined together, Mary and Darnley, made a very strong alliance for the English succession. I think that really was the tip of the iceberg for Elizabeth, but she was tolerant. She seemed to be a very tolerant queen. And once again, she had accepted this chain of events. But she was furious, and she called Darnley, ordered him to return to England. But he married Mary anyway. And one of the interesting things about Darnley, and I think this lends a real insight to the vagabond type of character he was, is that despite being raised as a Catholic, he later proclaimed to be Protestant. And it would seem to be from then on that he would, raise whichever of these two cards that might provide him the best outcome, especially when it came to matters of politics and court. So really, he would just one day be Catholic and the next he would be Protestant, depending on who he was dealing with. So he also refused to accompany Mary to Mass after their own wedding, and this was just to not anger the Protestant lords of the council. But very soon after their marriage, Darnley's outer layers began to just peel away like an onion, and his true character began to emerge. He was a drunk, a philanderer, he was violent, and he was rumoured to be sleeping with Mary's male secretary, David Rizzio. We know that what Darnley really wanted was to not only be the king consort, which is a ruling king via his marriage to a queen, but a king in his own right. But to do this, Mary would have had to grant Darnley with the crown matrimonial, and that would mean that if she would die without an heir, he would be the next in line of succession. But I mean, given his bad behaviour, Mary solidly refused to do that, understandably, and so Darnley began to drink more heavily, spend nights away from the palace inside taverns, and it just got to a point where Mary had had enough, and she spent more and more time with her Italian secretary, Rizzio. He would play cards with her, play music, they would dance, he would spend time in her chambers into the early hours of the morning. And so of course it wasn't long before the insanely jealous and bitter Darnley cooked up a plan with some of the lords to murder Rizzio. Every time I read about that tragic day in Mary's story, I cannot feel anything less than sympathy for her. I put myself in her shoes and I close my eyes and I think about what it must have felt like to endure that tragic evening. It just beggars belief. It happened in March in 1566, and Darnley and some of the lords entered Mary's supper room unannounced. At that time, Mary was dining with about 7 people, some of her company, including Rizzio, her secretary. And what happened next was to change the course of history. Darnley moved to one side whilst the lords dragged a terrified David Rizzio away from Mary. He was clinging to her skirts. He was terrified, and then once they managed to drag him away, he was stabbed 56 times in a chamber very close to her supper room. Now, this supper room looks today pretty much like it did back in 1566. And here is a picture that I took, and you can see here from this picture that the supper room is quite small. And Rizzio was said to have cowered by this window behind Mary's skirts, clinging onto them, begging her to save him, shouting, "Justice, justice." It must have been terribly frightening for him and also for her, because she couldn't protect him. There is also a picture here which I took, which is quite interesting, and it shows a blood stain on the floor, and it's quite visible when you go into her bed chambers. I believe it's wine, red wine, and not blood, as they like to tell visiting tourists. But the myth is an interesting one, so I don't blame them for coming up with that story. But if you look closely enough, you can see that the flooring is very modern. It definitely does not look like medieval flooring. So yeah, I believe that they just, throw some wine on there, and that's what they say to the tourists who come in to see it. But the very worst thing about that evening is that Mary herself was 6 months pregnant at the time. And she was so terrified that they had come in to kill her. One of the lords had held a pistol to her stomach in order to prevent her from interfering with what they were about to do to Rizzio. Anyway, after this incident, Mary had been able to escape, and she wrote to Elizabeth and told her all about it. And Elizabeth wrote back expressing her outrage at Darnley, and she gave her sympathy to Mary. She told Mary that she should punish Darnley and the lords involved. Those were her cousin's words. But Mary didn't exactly punish Darnley there and then. But it was said that after this event, she had proclaimed that she would exact her revenge on him. She would never love or trust him ever again, and she would falsely gain his trust just so that she could control him. And this I do believe. I think that she was clever enough to see that the only way that she could fight back was by gaining his trust, and also, playing things coolly and not losing her control. Darnley was really a despicable person, and even shortly after that event, he posted a declaration denying all knowledge or complicity in the Rizzio murder. But Mary by then believed that he had disgraced the whole kingdom, and she just would not forgive him. Darnley had every reason to be afraid at this point. His wife, the Queen, now despised him, and the lords that he had plotted the murder with were starting to turn their back on him too. And they were pointing their fingers at him and saying that he was the chief suspect in the murder. Nevertheless, 3 months after this murder, Mary moved to Edinburgh Castle with her ladies, and this was done for the safety of herself and her child, and she prepared to give birth to the next Scottish heir to the throne. At this point, it seemed that she would keep Darnley at arm's length, and can you blame her? So there she was in a draughty castle in Edinburgh, and here are some photos that I took of the castle. It sits atop of this imposing rock face, and it really looks impenetrable. and it looks dark and austere and cold, and I just can't imagine this place feeling, you know, happy at all, especially during those times when everybody used to walk about with, you know, swords and armor, and all. It just must have seemed so foreboding. Not really a nice place to be at all in those days. And when I was inside there, I got a real sense of melancholy inside many of these rooms, walking along those cobbled floors and cemented, you know, huge cemented walls, and it was always so dark, and it did make me feel quite uneasy. Here is a photograph I took of her bedchamber, her bedroom, and it was so large. It was a very big room. And I also took a photograph of the small tiny birth chamber where she gave birth to James. And it was, I walked into this tiny little room which was just off her main bed chamber, so it was just a little side room, sort of looked like an ensuite bathroom kind of thing. It was very small, and this is where she actually gave birth, apparently. So it's a very, very historic and important room, and there was nobody else but myself in there at the time. And I looked out of this little window, and here's a picture of the window where you could look down, and she would have probably stood at this window when she was having her contractions. She spent, you know, a good number of days in this room, and you just get this shiver down your spine, you know, standing in that spot. And I looked down and I could see Edinburgh outside that window, and thinking, gosh, it must have looked so different back then. Everything looked so modern now. There was cars, there was lorries and trucks and all sorts of, you know, modern things when you look outside that window. But I tried to picture what it might have looked like then, just hills and trees and really not much else. And it must have been so, she must have felt so vulnerable in that room when she gave birth to her son. So that's really the end of this part of the story. And in my next video, I'm going to talk about the tragic event that befell poor Darnley. I say poor Darnley because it's not nice really for anybody to be murdered, but I don't think anybody truly mourned him very much except for his parents, I'd say. But then Mary, Queen of Scots, became accused of his murder. So that is another story to tell. So I want to say thanks for joining me on this interesting story of Mary, Queen of Scots. It's really wonderful to be able to share my love of this story with you, and I hope in future Stitch With Me's I can, you know, come back and talk about other events and other places that have really interesting stories, and that you join me and hopefully you will enjoy them. So until then, I have to say happy stitching and take care, and I will be back again very soon. Bye for now.